Hey guys! Thank you so much for listening to our very first ever episode of Filed. We are so happy you are here. If you end up liking our show, we would love for you to leave us a review and tell all of your friends. Those are the two biggest ways for us to be able to grow our show. We do have big dreams. We're hoping to have guest speakers and to release merch at some point, but we can't do that without your guys' love and support. We also will be dropping brand new episodes every Friday on both Spotify and Apple Music, so tune in next Friday for a brand new episode of Filed. Okay, I do want to go ahead and jump into our first story, but I first want to put out a little disclaimer. This episode does contain details about harm to children, domestic abuse, and inappropriate sexual relationships. If you are not in the headspace for that, we totally understand, and we hope that you just tune in next week. We will be putting all sources for today's episode in the show notes, so if you're curious, you can go check those out. Considering I am from Arkansas, I did want to start this podcast with a story from Arkansas. So today, we're going to be talking about the most infamous Arkansas serial killer, Ronald Gene Simmons. Welcome to the Filed Podcast. On December 28, 1987, 24-year-old Kathy Kendrick was working her receptionist job at a small law firm in Russellville, Arkansas. It was early when her ex-coworker from a previous trucking job, Ronald Gene Simmons, entered into the firm. He was older with a long beard and was wearing a straw cowboy hat and a black leather jacket. When they had worked together, he had made several advances at her, which had been the reason he had been let go in the first place. However, this morning was different. Shortly after entering the firm, he had shot her in the head and killed Kathy using a handgun he had purchased that morning at a local Walmart in town. Brenda Hefner, who was also working in the firm, heard the gunshots and believed whatever gun had been used had been totally unloaded onto Kathy. Around 10:17 that morning, the police were called to the firm. However, when they arrived, Simmons had already left the scene. The officers would quickly discover that he had been headed for Taylor Oil Company. Julie Money, a bookkeeper for the company, was returning to work after using the restroom when she heard the gunshots. She opened the door to see Simmons holding a .22 revolver at her forehead. She could also see that 34-year-old father of four, J.D. Chafin, had been shot and killed and was lying in his own pool of blood. Simmons then shot at Julie, but thankfully the bullet missed her. And although he had killed J.D., his main goal was to annihilate Rusty Taylor, the owner of the Sinclair Mini Mart where Simmons had previously been employed. He had ended his employment there 10 days prior with complaints of how little he was being paid. While still at the oil company, Simmons had shot Rusty in the chest, which caused severe injury, but thankfully, Rusty would survive. At 10:27 that morning, police would receive a call stating that there had been another shooting. However, upon their arrival, Simmons had moved on to the Sinclair Mini Mart. At the Mini Mart, 38-year-old David Slayer was shopping when Simmons arrived. Simmons shot David and moved on to his true target, Roberta Woolery. Roberta was 46 years old and had worked with Simmons during his employment there. Simmons then approached Roberta and fired 2 gunshots at her. Nearby was crouching one of Roberta's friends, who decided to throw Coke cans at Simmons. This interaction caused him to flee the scene, and at 10:29, the police would receive another call stating that there had been another shooting. But again, as they arrived, Simmons had already left. Both David and Roberta would survive. The final call to police came in at 10:48 that morning from Woodline Motor Freight Company. Simmons had gone into the building, this time wearing a white baseball cap, and approached his previous supervisor, Elaine Butts. Elaine had been the one to end Simmons' advances towards Kathy, his first victim of the day. Simmons fired 2 shots at Elaine, one to her head and the other to her chest. During this interaction, he did not say a word, but as soon as it was over, he walked to the office nearby and closed the door. A woman, Vicki Jackson, was hiding behind the desk, and he held a gun to her head and assured her that he would not harm her. He helped Vicki to her feet and offered her a chair and a cigarette. After a brief conversation, he demanded she call 911, saying, "I've come to do what I wanted to do. It's all over now. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me." After this murder spree that lasted less than an hour, the police did arrive and took possession of Simmons' weapons and placed him into custody. Elaine would survive, but the police found after further investigation that Simmons' actions were far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. Ronald Gene Simmons was born in Chicago, Illinois on July 15, 1940, to his parents Loretta and William Simmons. At a young age, his father passed away and his mother shortly remarried to William D. Griffin. His new stepfather worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and his career would land the family in Little Rock, the capital of Arkansas, when Simmons was around 6 years old. Throughout the years, Simmons was moved with his family all around Arkansas. But in September of 1957, when he was around 18, he dropped out of school to join the U.S. Navy. His very first station was in Washington State at the Bremerton Naval Base. While stationed in Washington, he met and fell in love with a woman named Bersabe Rebecca Yulberry. I know for a fact that I am mispronouncing that, but she is often referred to as Becky. The couple moved to New Mexico, where they were married in July of 1960. 3 years later, Simmons left the Navy and joined the U.S. Air Force, where he would become a decorated serviceman within 2 years. At that point, he decided to retire, ending his military career in November of 1979. However, things started to turn for the worst around this time. Simmons and his wife were still living in New Mexico with several children when the Department of Human Services in Cloudcroft decided to start investigating the family. There had been allegations that Simmons had been having an incestuous relationship with Sheila, his 17-year-old daughter. Alarms went off when several had seen him kissing her goodbye rather passionately. She eventually detailed this to her school counselor, which resulted in charges being filed. However, when the family learned of the investigation, they fearfully left for Arkansas. The family finally settled on a 13-acre plot of land in Dover, which is located in Pope County, in 1983. At the time, Pope County had a population of less than 45,000. Where their home set, the family referred to as Mockingbird Hill, and living conditions were just not ideal. Inside of a privacy fence made with cinder block and barbed wire, 2 old mobile homes were conjoined together to form one. The driveway was lined with several no trespassing signs, and the yard was filled with trash, barrels, old cars, and other junk that Simmons called building material. The home lacked a telephone and indoor plumbing, but this is where the Simmons family called home. Several sources around the community claim that Simmons ran a tight household. The children's bus driver even claimed, quote, "He worked them like a general," end quote. Rumors of abuse to the children, incest, and spousal abuse surrounded the family. The wife, Becky, was not allowed to leave the home except to do laundry. She was not allowed to drive and was rumored to have bruising along her arms and face. The children did attend public schools, however, they were never allowed to go to any school functions. No one ever spent the night, and they never spent the night with anyone. They were at school on time, never had any disciplinary actions against them, and had excellent grades. The children were required to work around the home, which included digging the family outhouses. The family never attended church or socialized with anyone outside of each other. Anyone that was interviewed or asked about this family had little to nothing to say about them outside of a few rumors they had heard. But hindsight is 20/20. The Simmons flew under the radar and practically went unnoticed. This is possibly the reason that Ronald Gene Simmons' actions on December 22nd also went unnoticed. Following the murders of Kathy Kendrick and J.D. Chafin, the police would begin investigating Simmons, which led to a horrifying discovery. On the morning of December 22nd, 1987, 3 days after Simmons ended his employment at the Sinclair Mini Mart, Simmons drove into town and purchased a .22 caliber handgun and returned home. Once home, he began to bludgeon his 29-year-old son, Gene, until he shot him with a recently purchased handgun. He also bludgeoned his wife, Becky, and then shot her as well. Finally, he strangled his 3-year-old daughter, Barbara. After his murders, he sat amongst the bodies and downed a couple beers. He then soaked the bodies in kerosene to help hide the smell and carried them out to the cesspit, which were the outhouses the family had dug themselves. Later that day, 4 of his other children returned home: 17-year-old Loretta, 14-year-old Eddie, 11-year-old Marianne, and 8-year-old Becky. Considering that it was so close to Christmas, Simmons told his children that he had a present for each of them, but they could only receive the present separately. He took each child one by one to be beaten, strangled, and then drowned in rain barrels surrounding the property. For the next 4 days, Simmons stayed on his property, surrounded by 6 of his murdered family members. Then, on December 26, Simmons' son Billy and his wife Renata brought their son Trey, Simmons' grandson, to the home to celebrate the holidays. Upon arrival, Simmons shot and killed Billy and Renata in the dining room and drowned Trey. He also soaked their bodies in kerosene and placed them with the rest. The last of the family murders occurred later that day. Sheila, with a new last name McNulty, who was the daughter that Simmons had fathered a child with, arrived to the home alongside her husband Dennis. The couple had brought Michael, their son, and Sylvia Gale, the child which Simmons had fathered with his daughter. Again, the adults were shot, Sheila by the Christmas tree and Dennis by the entryway to the home, and the 2 children were strangled. Simmons then took the 4 bodies and lined them up neatly around the sitting room of the mobile home. He placed coats over their bodies except for Sheila, who was covered in his best tablecloth. The home was covered in bloody handprints along the walls, with large pools of blood in the living room carpet. The Christmas tree was still up with beautifully wrapped presents under it. Toys were scattered throughout the rooms from children playing with them, and the cars of the holiday visitors were still parked out front. Simmons then left the home for a drink at the local bar. Once he returned to his self-made crime scene, he sat inside while he continued to drink and watch television, all while being surrounded by 4 of his dead loved ones for the next 2 nights. Russellville police officers took Simmons into custody at Woodline Motor Freight on the morning of December 28, 1987. His murderous rampage had taken 16 lives in the matter of days. He was sent to the Arkansas State Hospital in Little Rock for a psych evaluation, which determined that he was fit to stand trial. At trial, the prosecuting attorney attempted to present evidence of a motive by presenting a letter which had been found in Simmons' safe deposit box. The letter concerned an inappropriate relationship with his daughter, Sheila. The judge deemed the letter admissible, and when Simmons heard this, he became physically angry and attacked the judge. During the altercation, Simmons reached for the officer's gun, but was thankfully unsuccessful. After 2 trials, Simmons had been found guilty of the deaths of Kathy Kendrick and J.D. Chafin, as well as 14 counts of capital murder for the deaths of his loved ones. The death penalty was to be administered against him, plus 147 years. During this time, Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas, and he was the one to sign Simmons' death by lethal injection. While on death row, he refused to appeal his sentence, and in fact, he wanted to be put to death. Other death row inmates thought this would be hurting their chances of successful appeals. And because of this belief, several inmates threatened or attempted to take Simmons' life. In fact, it was such a big deal that one of Simmons' friends took this case all the way to the Supreme Court. Jonas Whitmore wanted to speak for Simmons as next of friend and appeal his death row conviction. However, in the Supreme Court's 1990 opinion, Whitmore lacked standing, and the case was dismissed. On June 25, 1990, Simmons was set to be put to death. He had denied all visitors, lawyers, or clergy to be present during the execution. Simmons' last words were, quote, "Justice delayed, finally be done, is justifiable homicide," end quote. Which, what an eerie sentence to end a life with. His body was not claimed by any of his family members after the execution. He was buried on a pauper's plot in Lincoln Memorial, which is located in Varner. No one knows for sure why Ronald Gene Simmons did what he did. Maybe he lost control. Maybe he wanted to start his life over. Maybe he didn't feel like he had control. Maybe he thought he had failed his family by not being able to stay employed or to keep them together. Whatever the reason, I want to read a portion of a letter that Becky, Simmons' wife, wrote to Bill, Renata, and Trey right before she was murdered by her own husband. "I've remembered a lot what you said, Bill. I am a prisoner here, and the kids too. I know when I get out I might need help. Dad has me like a prisoner. That the freedom might be hard to take, yet I know it would be great. Having my children visit me anytime, having a telephone, going shopping if I want, going to church. Every time I think of freedom, I want out as soon as possible. And I think it's best while or before I get too old. I want out, but it's the beginning. Once I get a job and a place, then I can handle it. With the mental support of my children, I can do it. It is hard to talk in front of Gene. He's been having it so hard, and his problems were deeply in my mind. I felt sorry for him. I was so afraid of what he might go back and do. You are lucky, Bill. You have a very good wife. She led you to the right way, and that is toward God. She is very pretty, too. I have always thanked God for sending you a good wife, and I'm thankful for Dennis as well. Give my darling Trey a lot of hugs and kisses for me. I love you all very much. Barbara gets bored if I take too long to write, so I hope I made sense in this letter. Hope Loretta can mail this Friday or Saturday on her way home. I love you very much, Mom. P.S. If you all look very nice when you came. Loretta had a great time. She talked about it a lot. Thank you guys so much for listening. This was a really hard case for me to research, but I feel like it was a good way to start off our show because it is based in Arkansas. We would love to hear your comments and feedback on our episodes. If you want to hop over onto our Instagram or Facebook, both are at The Filed Podcast. We would love to hear from you. We also hope that you tune in next week for a brand new episode of Filed. Bye.